All right, so what can we conclude about recessionary and inflationary gaps? What's the general takeaway here, and how does it apply to a growing economy? That's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so you could have self-correcting mechanisms, inflation or deflation, which would lead to the elimination of the inflationary and recessionary gap, respectively. But particularly for recessions, deflation in the form of lower input costs, lower wages, is less likely to happen. Okay, so the self-correcting mechanism for recession isn't reliable. Moreover, for inflationary gaps, in order to kind of get out of them, we have to inflate the value of the money. That has kind of arbitrary effects on, or not arbitrary, but broad effects, such as actually arbitrary redistribution. So if I have most of my cash or most of my wealth in cash, you have most of your wealth in debt, and someone else has most of their wealth in stocks, well, guess what? Me with the wealth in cash in my checking account or whatever, or my savings account, I'm going to be essentially poorer, while the person with the most of their wealth in debt is going to be effectively richer than they had been before, and the person with most of their wealth in stocks is also going to be richer. Okay, so it doesn't it's redistribution, but it's arbitrary redistribution. It's not, let's say, progressive redistribution where it's like, going from the rich to the poor. No, it's going to whoever just happens to have cash at that particular time. In fact, in my experience, I think that, or in my observation, I think that inflation tends to benefit the rich and hurt the poor, because who's most likely to have, a small amount of savings in cash versus who's most likely to have most of their assets in the stock market. And I don't think I have to tell you. Okay. It's also particularly for a recession that's slow, it's uneven. It's not always going to be the case that like with a recessionary gap, the self-correcting mechanism is not going to come to your rescue in any reasonable time frame. Okay. More likely what's going to happen is someone's going to be unemployed, right? So, and that's the uneven part of it, right? So someone keeps the same wage, someone gets unemployed. Positive effects on either inflation or unemployment may be offset by opposing forces. What I mean by that is if there's deflation such that your real wealth feels better, okay, so prices are dropping, so you feel like you can consume more, someone's going to be unemployed, right? Leading to kind of an offset, right? The wealth benefit that you get from feeling richer is offset by, some people are being unemployed. On the other hand, the positive effects from an inflationary gap of dropping unemployment is that eventually you're going to have inflation, so that prices are going to increase, making you feel like even though you might keep your job and your salary might be the same, your actual salary is going to be, being kind of shaved off by inflation. Okay. So the self-correcting mechanisms aren't the best case scenario. Okay. So we're in lecture slide 7 and lecture 8. We're going to talk about fiscal and monetary policy, or we have to do money and banking before monetary policy. But in the coming lectures, we're going to talk about fiscal and monetary policy, really to answer the question, how do we correct for a recession? How do we correct for inflation without leading to unemployment? Those kind of things. All right. So next up on the docket, I kind of want to do a little bit of a shift here, but I don't want to chunk it off as its own video because that video was short. Applying the model of aggregate demand, aggregate supply to the actual U.S. economy. right? So the real economy is going to be growing, right? We have a growth rate of about 2 to 3% year over year. So, the real economy in the 70s is going to be at a different level than the real economy in the 2010s or 2020s now. Ugh. I'm old, guys. All right. So let's get rid of, no, we don't have to get rid of too much. So I'm just going to move this down for time being. That did not behave as expected. Seldom does this app. Okay, so I want a second demand curve too. So the old equilibrium, let's say the 70s, I'm going to draw with the, I guess, red. So this could be the 70s equilibrium, right? So we have, let's say, demand curve 1, supply, I guess your supply curve T. Oh, come on, everything's slow today. Just do this. There we go. So I'm going to call this demand curve D70 for demand curve in 1970, an arbitrary year I picked. And I will call this demand curve 20 for 2020. Okay. I know it's 2021, I'm going by decades, right? Then we'll have this supply curve be the supply curve for the 70s, and this is the supply curve for the 2020s. Okay. So in a growing economy, right, the supply is going to shift out, right? Things become, generally speaking, your technology is going to improve. You might have a more supply of labor, more supply of capital. Yeah, so those would be probably the big three things, with technology being the biggest growth in the long term for aggregate supply. Okay, in terms of aggregate demand, again, population is going to be increasing, leading to higher consumption, higher investments, higher everything, right? That'll probably be the biggest driving factor for demand, overall population growth. Okay, so you have demand shifting out here, you have supply shifting out here. Okay, so a shift out is a shift rightward. Okay, higher output. Okay, so you're moving from this red equilibrium to this purple equilibrium. Okay, and it's going to happen gradually, of course. So supply is going to shift out 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, and it's going to eventually going to hit this red line. And demand is going to shift out 1 year and 1 year and 1 year and 1 year, and eventually going to hit the blue line. Okay. So let's say this is the actual state of the world. We've moved from this red to this purple equilibrium. In this case, we have both growth, right? A move outward from the x-axis. Okay, so we move from red to purple. So we have higher equilibrium GDP, and we have inflation, a move up along the y-axis. So from here to the purple line. Okay, so this upward shift is the inflation. All right, and that happens in the real world. So I'll show you. Okay, so between 1972 and 2007, we had a higher price level, higher GDP growth and inflation. That's the normal case. Okay, 2008, 2009, we had minor inflation, lower GDP. Okay, so that would be the case of minor inflation, lower GDP. Oh, sorry. So minor inflation, lower GDP would basically be any demand curve. Let's say if this is our supply curve is fixed, any demand curve that leads to a lower equilibrium GDP, but is still higher here. Okay, so this could be a potential, let's say, new demand curve. If this is the old equilibrium GDP, this could be the new equilibrium GDP. So higher prices, lower GDP. Okay. Could be something like this too. So I'm getting way closer, so harder to see. So maybe I should stick with that. Come on. All right, you get the point. I'm not messing around with this graph anymore. It's bugging the crap out of me. All right. So this is over the long run what the economy is doing. So you have real GDP and you have the price level. So as though this were so these are the same axes as an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And each dot is essentially the equilibrium price level and equilibrium GDP. So come on, where'd it go? I just set it to visible, didn't I? Oh. Okay, so if you take each dot, there's an implied demand curve, aggregate demand curve, and implied aggregate supply curve intersecting at that dot. Okay, so you can see that here. Okay, so like 1984 to 1985, it looks like demand shifted up by a little, or to the right by a little, and supply shifted to the right by a little. And then you have both shifting to the right by a little in 1986, and then by a little in 1987. You get kind of the point up until, in this case, 2008 to 2009. You had your, let's say, demand curve shift back, and you had supply curve shift back by a lot, basically. Okay. So that led to higher prices, higher prices, lower output, lower GDP. Okay, but then it kind of chugged along back the next year, etc. All right. So year over year, you can kind of visualize like a demand curve shifting and a supply curve simultaneously shifting. Okay, and when that happens, you can see potential GDP eventually shifting as technology increases. Okay. Okay, so aggregate demand and aggregate supply are constantly moving. On average, aggregate demand is going to grow because of growing population leading to more demand, so consumer and investment goods is going to increase. On top of that, you're going to have increased size of government, so increased government purchases are going to shift up aggregate expenditures, okay, leading to higher aggregate demand. On the aggregate supply curve, you're going to have more workers, more productivity, shifting out aggregate supply. These shifts generally generate fluctuation in prices, inflation, or sometimes deflation, less likely, and GDP growth, or generally speaking, GDP growth. Okay. So here's another example. So in this case, supply shifted up by a little, or I should say shifted to the right by a little, whereas demand shifted to the right by a lot. This is what we call demand pull inflation. So demand is shifting by a lot, leading to a higher price level, okay, leading to inflation. Or is inflation, higher price level is inflation, I should say, leads to inflation, okay? So demand, by virtue of demand shifting by more than supply shifted, you have higher prices, okay? This is the general state of things, right? This is how the world normally works. Higher output, higher prices, okay? So if aggregate demand is growing faster than your aggregate supply, you're going to have faster growth, okay? So huge jump to the right, and inflation, a jump up, okay? If demand is growing slower than aggregate supply, you're going to have less of a jump, okay? So if the demand curve were like here, okay, or let's say this, let's do this actually. Let's say supply curve jumped up by a lot, demand only jumped up by a little. Okay, you're actually going to have lower prices and higher growth. Okay, but but supply curve is generally not going to move out this far. So let's say supply curve just grew a little bit faster than the demand curve. Relative to a demand change, you're still going to have you're still going to have higher growth, but relative to a demand change, it's not going to be as far out, which is probably good because you're probably not going to have that inflationary gap, and prices aren't going to be increasing by as much. Okay. So this is demand-led growth. So huge jump, so higher GDP, higher inflation. This is supply-led growth, so modest jump, modest increase in prices here. Okay, because in this case, the demand is actually still, even though I say it's supply-led growth, the demand is actually still increasing more than the supply shifted right. So there was a price increase. So if aggregate supply shifts inwards, okay, you're going to have a rapid price increase with output decline. Okay, that's the stagflation case that we talked about. Okay, if aggregate supply grows faster, you're going to have a favorable supply shock leading to faster economic growth, and that's the case here, right? So you have higher output and lower prices. This is the best of both possible worlds. This is the best of both possible worlds. This is the best of both possible worlds. So higher output, lower prices. This is real GDP growth. This is great. Okay. I mean, in any case, this would be real GDP growth because it's real GDP on the x-axis. But it's real GDP growth that feels especially good. Okay. So this is deflationary real GDP growth. Okay. Okay. Sorry. This is adverse supply shock. So this is stagflation here. Okay. This is favorable supply shock. So supply shifts out by a lot. So this is like all of a sudden we got super productive. We got computers where computers didn't exist any before. Okay. The ideal situation would be one with output at full potential, so equilibrium GDP, equal potential GDP, and stable prices. That's really hard to do because you have shocks and responses to shocks and market forces leading to being above or below potential GDP. If the shocks are small enough, the economy can self-correct. It's just going to take a while. If the shocks are large, we might need the government to step in. Okay, so that's where the next essentially phase of this course will be. The Marvel Universe has phases 1, 2, and 3. and now they're all 4. The class is essentially phases 1 and 2. Phase 1 is building up to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We're done that. We're at the Avengers. Okay. Phase 2 is now we're going to be introducing fiscal policy. We're going to be introducing monetary policy. Okay. So that's going to be bringing in Spider-Man and Ant-Man and all that. Okay. So looking forward in the class, we're going to start talking about fiscal policy, which is the government response to the shock. And then we're going to talk about money and banking, which will eventually lead into monetary policy, which is going to be the Federal Reserve, which is technically, or is more or less a branch of government, or not branch, but a unit of government, an agent of government. But how the Federal Reserve, and in conjunction with the Treasury, does different things within their tool set to counteract a recession or inflation. So that's where we'll be in the next 3 or 4 lectures. All right. Cool. So that we're going to actually jump right into that now because I probably still have some time in this lecture. So cool. We're going to move on to slide deck. I think it's 7.